On 31st October and 1 November 2023, the South African government published in the Government Gazette certain regulations with regard to the export of agricultural products to Europe. Now, I'm not going to read these regulations, I'll put them up on the screen, but I'm referring particularly to Section 5, published on the 31st of October, and Section 7, published on the 1st of November, which makes it quite clear that in the issuing of export permits to the European Union and Britain, race and racial ownership, the skin color of the farmer and the farming business, should be a criteria considered. In other words, that a farmer and an agricultural organization or institution could be prevented from exporting if they do not comply with requirements that have to do with skin color. Now, yes, there are certain caveats. It doesn't affect every single type of product that is produced on a farm, and so forth and so forth. But these caveats do not change the underlying principle that is at play here, which is that the South African government in the year 2023 still thinks it appropriate to use skin color as a criteria for determining whether someone should be allowed or prevented by the government to participate in certain economic activities. Now, commercial farmers in South Africa are among the best farmers in the world and among the leading farmers in a variety of products. In the last year, South African agricultural exports were around 240 billion rand, which is close to 12 billion euros, with 20% of this heading to the European Union and 4% to the United Kingdom. Now, of course, the South African government thinks it a good idea to implement these racial regulations under the banner of transformation and black economic empowerment. Now, as we know in South Africa, transformation and black economic empowerment has failed for a variety of reasons, which is not the focus of this video. But I can say that the broad conclusion as to why these policies are failing has to do with government corruption. And this is not my own opinion. It's the main conclusion reached by former President Kgalema Motlanthe when he looked into this matter. Now, in the early 1990s, the eyes of the world were fixed on South Africa as the country was transitioning into a new political dispensation. A negotiated settlement was reached in 1994, and the South African constitution that's still in place today was adopted in 1996. Now, much was said during this political transition, but it should be stated that, among others, it was founded on certain universally accepted principles of constitutionalism. This includes that no section of society be systematically targeted on the basis of their ethnic identity, that all shall have the right to pursue the occupation of their choice, that all shall have the opportunity to flourish in accordance with their own contribution and merit, that no citizen shall be reduced to second-class citizenship, and that minority rights should be upheld and protected. 3 decades down the line, the South African government is breaking these principles and in essence breaking the agreement that was reached in 1994. Today, South Africa is the only country in the world where more than 80% of the population is protected with affirmative action policies against a small minority. Now, this is not only done in a way that impacts negatively on minority communities in South Africa, particularly farmers and white farmers, but also on South Africa's trading partners abroad. Now, there's some controversy in the media regarding these regulations that were published, with some saying that it's actually old regulations that was just updated now, with media institutions and certain agricultural institutions reminding us that it's not applicable to all farmers in all circumstances. And of course, the South African government, as could have been predicted, outwardly denying the whole thing, saying that there's no racial discrimination when it comes to exports in this regard, despite the fact that it's clearly stated in the Government Gazette that was just published by the South African government. Now, as Stu de Jager, president of the Southern African Agri Initiative and the former president of the World Farmers Organization, has said, "We are quite concerned about the fact that among agricultural organizations in South Africa, we see that some are working hard to represent their members when they speak to the government, but then there are some who seem to be working tirelessly to represent the government when they speak to their members, who are always quick to rush to defend the South African government when such discriminatory policies are being implemented." So in this spirit, we had agricultural organizations in South Africa who are supposed to represent the farmers who were quick to rush to the South African government's defense when it started flirting with the idea of scrapping or severely changing the property rights clause in the South African constitution to enable the state to expropriate private property, particularly farms, without compensation. We had and we still have agricultural organizations who are quick to rush to the South African government's defense when they are criticized for not doing enough to prevent farm murders. And now again, we have agricultural organizations rushing to the government's defense when it publishes regulations in the Government Gazette that the government intends to discriminate against farmers on the basis of the color of their skin. Fortunately, this is not applicable to all government organizations. So the South African Agri Initiative, or SAI as we know it, is currently preparing legal action against the South African government in this regard. At the Solidarity Movement, we have also written to members of the European Union to bring this under their attention and to ask for a public discussion within the European Union about the extent to which the South African government is discriminating on the basis of race against farmers who are exporting to the European Union. But we should underline here that this is not merely about the exporting of certain agricultural products. What's currently happening in South Africa is a new form of apartheid that is being implemented, or ANC apartheid as we should call it. In South Africa, as we speak, there are more than 100 laws and regulations that discriminate against people on the basis of the color of their skin. I'm not aware of a country in the history of the world that has had more discriminatory, exclusionary race laws than the South African government has today. This is systematic discrimination and exclusion merely on the basis of the color of a certain section of society's skin. Which of course is quite strange because the South African government and the ruling ANC in particular used to be a staunch activist against apartheid. It seems now, however, that they only advocated against apartheid so that they can gain control of the levers of power, so that they could implement their own policy of apartheid. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination defines race discrimination as follows. The term racial discrimination shall mean any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Sounds familiar? If you live in South Africa today, it certainly would sound familiar. But it doesn't end there. The International Criminal Court and the Rome Statute particularly defines apartheid, which is today recognized as a crime against humanity, as follows. The crime of apartheid means inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid defines apartheid as inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Any legislative measures and other measures calculated to prevent a racial group or groups from participation in the political, social, economic, and cultural life of the country, and the deliberate creation of conditions preventing the full development of such group or groups. In particular, by denying to members of a racial group or groups basic human rights and freedoms, including the right to work, the right to form recognized trade unions, the right to education, the right to leave and to return to their country, the right to a nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Now, at this point, let me emphasize, we cannot allow our moral framework to be determined by what the law or some international covenant says. Something is immoral, regardless of whether the law agrees that it is immoral. But in this case, the law, at least in the international sphere, does agree that this is immoral, even though the law in South Africa does not agree that this is immoral. Now, ever since the ANC, the party of Nelson Mandela, came to power in 1994, the world has been turning a blind eye to what is happening in South Africa. But they cannot afford to turn a blind eye much longer, because what's happening in South Africa is starting to have an impact on the rest of the world. And it's up to us to make sure that the rest of the world does indeed take notice of what is happening in South Africa. But not only take notice, but also to take a firm stance against these type of atrocities. This is why the Solidarity Movement and the various institutions that form part of the Solidarity Movement will fight this in South Africa in the courts, but also in the international sphere. But the most important thing remains not what we say, but what we do today, tomorrow, and the day thereafter to take ownership of what is rightfully ours to ensure a future for our communities. Not merely by making good arguments and pointing out double standards, but by doing things that make a tangible difference in the real world. By preserving the good things that need to be preserved and fighting the evil that needs to be fought.